All right, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this special presentation with Dr. Mattingly. I'm just going to turn it over right to him. Real quickly, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end of the session. We have our Q&A. So, Dr. Mattingly, please take it away.
So, welcome everyone. Sorry, which installment are we in? Which week are we in? This week is 4 or 5? 2, 3. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for letting me know. All right, so awesome. It's so awesome to meet the our first cohort for the Patients Professors Academy. Oh shoot, let me go ahead and share my screen as well. So I know many of you have already kind of watched the initial videos, so I'm not going to regurgitate a lot of the information that we shared during the video. But with that said, I will review some of the concepts so that make sure we're all speaking the same language. But predominantly today, for today's agenda, we'd like to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. So I'll do a very brief intro, kind of also let you all know a little bit more about who I am and why I'm interested in this this area of work. I really ultimately want you to also make sure you have the link. I put a link in the chat for the textbook because the textbook is free, openly available to anyone. And so I think it's important to, don't take my word for it. Go back to the textbook if you want to do additional reading. We're only looking at chapter 7 in program evaluation, but it's actually the textbook that I use. I teach a comparative effectiveness research and patient-centered outcomes research course at the University of Maryland offered to our master's and PhD students. So if you work on that textbook, you'll be right with our PhD students. We'll do some brief reviews and then getting into some discussion, okay? So that's sort of the goal for today. So don't be shy. Joe and Kaylee are gonna help me as we get questions and things like that. If I'm sometimes I get going and I'm not paying attention to the chat box, so they'll let me know. And then hopefully we'll also be able to, unmute some folks and people can comment. So I'm an associate professor and a vice chair of academic affairs at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. I'm a pharmacist by trade. That's actually kind of what I want to start with and talk about why am I interested in things like engagement or engagement evaluation. Here's me with some students down in Santo Domingo, Ecuador. As a pharmacist, often when participating in different community events, clinically speaking, it's sometimes you think about clinical metrics or things like that we're trying to see. How many people did we reach? How many patients received vaccination? How many patients received counseling or the medication that they need? In Ecuador, for example, we were providing a free clinic, multidisciplinary clinic, where we were providing medications but more importantly, not just the one-time clinic that was important. The bigger part of this program, and we talk about program evaluation, is we didn't want to just have a situation where we fly into Ecuador, give patients medications for one clinic visit, and then just kind of fly right back out, right? In terms of what's the overall impact of a program, this particular program does a lot of work specifically with the university, one of the main universities in Quito, Ecuador, and works to fund a full-time clinic in Ecuador. So the brigades, when we take these large groups of students and stuff down there, it's really about engaging more patients, identifying problems, and then getting them linked to care, linked to that main clinic. So, and this is just one example where I still get to be more of a pharmacist instead of a researcher, so I get to do a lot more clinical work. But when we think about asking, is this program effective? What are the different ways we can evaluate that, right? And so that's what today's discussion is going to be about. So like I said, feel free throughout the take a look at the link. Chapter 7 is what a lot of this information comes from, and I think you'll find it useful. You'll find a lot of the other chapters may be relevant to your work, depending on what are your interests. So this was, as you can see, a collaboration for the NIH, the large Clinical and Translational Science Awards. You've used this. This is part of their community engagement core. Yeah, so what do we mean by evaluation or program evaluation? So I talked about in the video, we're talking about systematic collection of information about the activities, the characteristics of the program, and outcomes that may reduce uncertainties. Like maybe we find out about things that we didn't know before. Maybe we're trying to improve effectiveness or make decisions or figure out if it can influence decision making. And the main evaluation types that I talked about in the video are the way you could kind of categorize different evaluation types. There are formative evaluation. This often we think about this for teachers. We think about formative evaluations when we ask our students to give us feedback. We say, how did the professor do? Any just general feedback improvements that we can do. So formative feedback, you can sometimes think about that customer satisfaction in ways I like to think about it a lot. Process evaluation, we're trying to understand is the program actually getting to the target recipients? Like, are we actually reaching the people that we want to reach? In the case of that clinic that I briefly touched on in Santo Domingo, Ecuador, our primary focus are the those that are not covered by their health insurance, and they have a large uninsured population. So we're trying to actually get to patients who maybe are unable to afford medications or seek care, and so then maybe they're not seeing a regular physician or a pharmacist regularly. So it's trying to get that initial access to care, identifying any problems, and then link them back to care. So for that particular program has a specific goal, and so the question we might ask is, well, who are we really catching? So we have to make sure when we're collecting patient information for that clinic is that we're at the intake, when patients are coming in and registering and signing up, we make sure we're trying to confirm, like, is it really reaching? And we're not turning anyone away, but as we review at the end of the week, when we finish up the clinic, we want to look at that data and say, how many patients and how many patients that kind of met our intended population, would have met that criteria. Summative, we talk about, I like to, that's why I use the quotes for summary judgments. It's trying to figure out, is the program working? Sometimes this means you got to make some explicit criteria to say yes, no, like it's been a success or not a success. So sometimes thinking about ahead of time, like, what is a good goal? Do we want to reach 500 people in your initial program? I don't know if you have some quantitative amount or and then the outcome, when you think about outcome evaluations, that's actually focused more on not necessarily the program outcome. I mean, I guess you can think about the program outcome, but that's often the summative judgments for the program. For the outcomes in this context, is typically around, like, if we're doing something with health, primarily like health behaviors, health outcomes, we want to know, are the patients that we're reaching or trying to work with, are they reaching their specified outcomes? So this might be like a smoking cessation program. Like, you want to know, are the patients who enroll in your program actually, like, what are their, what is the effects of them actually enrolled in the program? So, like, for example, this patient's Professors Academy, we are hoping to increase the knowledge and capacity for our patient community members to maybe be that next level expert to serve as advisors to pharmaceutical companies or to researchers at universities who are looking to work with a lot of community community members, and sometimes having that little extra knowledge about how all these research projects go. It lets that patient not be so intimidated when they jump on a board or jump on it as a community advisor. So, a good outcome for us for this program would be to follow up with our initial cohort in 6 months or a year and say, hey, did you serve on an advisory board, and how did it go? Like, was it successful? Did you feel like it was helpful? Like, so something like that might be a good example of understanding what our outcomes for our intended audience potentially. And then impact is getting at that. Sometimes it's hard to evaluate impact in a 1 or 2 year time frame. It may be a multi-year type of time frame. So maybe the larger impact is so like our clinic in Ecuador is about improving the public health in those regions, right? And so that may take years. But so ultimately, there's a lot of different evaluation types to think about. All right, so for discussion. So here's where I want to make sure it's not just me talking at you guys. So I'll open it up to the group. Why is it important to evaluate processes? So I talk about process outcomes. Why is it important to evaluate processes in addition to, say, patient outcomes?
Joey, there's a question. Yeah, there's a question of, what do you consider the best practices to be considered, outcome or impact?
Oh, great question. So I'll use my economist answer, and that it depends. So I won't answer actually. So like ultimately, you're saying like which is better, one or the other, or was the question what are the best practice for one or like best practice for process? Make sure I understand the question. Is that from
I mean,
the
the best practices that's advised usually in our way of doing activities. So what do we consider it as impact or outcome?
Yeah, so so that I will go back to kind of it depends. So you got to start with what is the goal of the project, right? So broadly speaking, this week is about programmatic evaluation. So programs range from a research project. The program could be education based, so it's about maybe learning outcomes. The project could be oh gosh, or it could be engagement. You know, we have an entire engagement team with the patients program, and their outcomes are often like number of people reached and the making sure we're getting to the right people. So that's when you talk about outcomes, or like I would argue that you have to think about all of the different evaluation types and then ask yourself what's most relevant to what I'm working on, because they're all, I think, important. So if as a teacher, I think about my stated goal as a professor in my courses that I teach, I'm going to have formative evaluations that I want to hear from my students to know just feedback for quality improvement in my class. But ultimately, I want to make sure my students are meeting the or understanding the material and meeting the learning objectives that I state. So that's an outcome for the student. Broadly speaking, I want to have impact, and I want to make sure my students can get jobs when they graduate. I want to make sure that my students can be successful when they graduate and had a good experience at the University of Maryland. So I still think impact's important. So maybe I hope I'm not dodging the answer. I really do believe that it's multifaceted. So good question. So back to the, I know I had a hand raised. So did someone want to answer the why is it important to evaluate processes in addition to outcomes?
This is Jayashree Shankarnarayanan, and great presentation. I personally feel that we have to evaluate processes for program improvement.
Oh, absolutely. I love that idea. So do you have any examples or things you want to share, like where you've maybe evaluated a process?
Yeah, so I have been a professor at a couple of different universities, Nebraska and Connecticut. And I know, like when I teach a course, definitely there are these quantitative outcomes in terms of satisfaction and things like that. But I'm also evaluating the students, through exams, as well as also getting some feedback on how to improve the course. So and I do it in time. And it's better to do it in real time, because then you can improve the course, as well as it also informs the future courses you teach.
That's right. That's right. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The one question I had was, I think most of the program evaluation are focused on prospective studies. How does one evaluate programs that have already occurred, and there is data available? So it becomes more like a retrospective program evaluation. So does that, does this presentation also cover the retrospective program evaluations? Or is it only focused on prospective?
So this is not, so my apologies if it seemed as if it was only responding to the development of a program. You certainly can evaluate projects after they occur. The ultimate thing that we have to consider is that if we did not consider our evaluation methods when we develop the program, we may have data, we may just have data that's limited, right? So it may just have data that, oh, we forgot to ask it in this way, or right? So you may have limited data, but that doesn't mean you can't evaluate it. So I would highly encourage you to always consider looking back, and I think retrospective analyses are great sometimes, and also depending on what your goals are, you can take what you've learned from something that's already occurred, and then maybe write the next proposal to say, hey, we didn't evaluate this, and now we need to, so we would like to write this proposal. So just something to consider. Mike, I see you've got your hand up. If you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Joey.
So Dr. Mattingly, I'm going to ask you a somewhat embarrassing question. Okay. When you put together the PPA program for us, Did you actually come to conclusions about how you would evaluate the program as opposed to our individual involvement in it? And how did you prioritize that type of evaluation?
Oh, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm probably not the right person to answer specific because I'm not the program evaluator for PPA. So I don't know if Joe or I thought I said Hillary on earlier too. Hillary might even be if she's still on.
I'm asking this because it puts it into a context for something that we're all familiar with already. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I love that question, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in working with our advisory board, that involve patients and community members. There was a big part of, you know, we don't want to get trapped in this train and pray model that we just hope that people go through the sessions and that they're going to be able to turn it into something else. There was always a determination that we wanted to see how people responded to, you know, the 5-week course, but also, you know, tracking and working with people past the academy. What do they want to do? You know, how are they using what they learned in their practice, in their own work with their communities, however they define it.
Yeah,
Kind of that continuous support of going forward, and that's something that we're going to be discussing with everyone in the academy in the next couple of weeks as well. Right.
Yeah, and to add to that, Mike, what I would also suggest, and this is probably important for all those in attendance, you are the inaugural class, and it's critical to think about that as well. Now I won't speak for those who you know, as they put the program together, they were very thoughtful in like what they were trying to do with this first class. But I'll just use my own like some of my own studies where I've gone into program evaluation. If it's a new area, it's the first time doing something, I sort of know that there's going to be like, I guess I have to be humble that I may not know what the heck I'm talking about when I'm getting started. Like I think I know what I'm talking, like I maybe have done literature review, I've seen other similar programs, but like I have to know that there are these known unknowns and unknown unknowns. You know, sometimes you walk into a situation, you're like, oh, I did not consider this. So a good example in the early, I guess 2013, 14, I did a project with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute focused on underserved populations with hepatitis C. It was a wonderful pilot project to get started. We worked with a lot of amazing individuals in the West Baltimore community. And as I form my both my patient advisors and my community or my clinicians, and I focus primarily on things like health services research or health services delivery. So I had a lot of clinicians. I had people who had expertise in service delivery. What I didn't have or didn't anticipate was I needed some folks from maybe housing and urban development involved, or maybe I should have considered a way to bring those in, because during one of our town hall meetings, I had a patient inform me that one of the driving factors for her getting treated for hepatitis C was that she needed to stop using heroin and needed to get into a drug treatment program, but that also could ultimately impact her. If she went into a drug treatment program, she might actually lose her Social Security temporarily. It got into other factors that I wasn't anticipating, that she was weighing like not being able to afford her monthly payment in her apartment if she lost her benefits. And these were like learnings for me that I was like, I knew that we had a lot of different patients that had these other unmet needs, but I didn't realize how sometimes our housing agencies at the state level aren't talking to the Medicaid and healthcare agencies, right? Like they're maybe not working together as collaboratively as I would have liked. So as I've gone beyond that project, if I were to redo that project again, I might have invited a few more folks outside the healthcare realm, more just, you know, not just purely social services, but actually like maybe from the government that's involved in something like that. So I don't know if that's a good example, Mike, but I think that my point is when you start a new project, I think there's some level of like trying to anticipate what you know you don't know, and then also being open to the unknown unknowns. And so that's why I think it's always good to have, or for me, I try to do some type of mixed method approach where, and we talked about a little bit in the video where you can do gaining qualitative input as well as quantitative, so not purely one or the other. Sometimes researchers are more comfortable doing one or the other. I personally try to bring up multidisciplinary research team that can handle both types of methods. So wonderful question, Mike. Other questions on, yeah, great. Other questions on why you might choose to do a process evaluation in addition to outcomes?
Here's what I found.
Oh, anyone? Let me see if I can catch up to the chat box. I see a lot of stuff in the chat box. Oh, go ahead. Was there someone that raised their hand?
Well, I think you need to do a process evaluation because the processes directly impact the outcomes. So if you're not getting the outcomes that you want, you have to go back and make sure that you're taking the right steps to get there.
Oh, I love that. So yeah, so actually being more iterative, right? So again, back to what, as you're talking about, you learn, wait, we're not meeting our marks, so maybe we need to go back and look. So like a good example might be your delivery method, right? Like what if the delivery, and if we use education, maybe the educational delivery is in the classroom and it's a 1 hour in-person meeting every single week, and maybe it's at a time that's we don't realize is inconvenient for the target audience, and then maybe the attendance is low or not effective. So like maybe we have to change our process. Maybe we have to think about recording or providing things asynchronously in addition to the in-person. Or I think it's a wonderful example. And again, being open to that continuous improvement. That's a great example. All right. Any other suggestions or thoughts?
A word that got used in our discussions in one of the previous sessions, which has really resonated with me in terms of all of this, is the idea of a tapestry. We have so many different elements coming together in programs like this. I mean, different types of community working in teams, different experiences historically, which affect the way people think about everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, tapestries fall to pieces really easily if they are not constructed properly. And I think one of the challenges probably everybody is facing at the moment as we start to do this type of study is that it is hard to get everybody onto the same page, to work closely together, as opposed to bringing their particular expertise to the program with their particular opinions. Ideally, you're trying to get both things together.
Yeah. Well, and I guess maybe back to the comment about evaluating a program that's already occurred. There's still a value in that, because just because a program, was developed and implemented and put out in the community, and we didn't think about all the ways we wanted to evaluate it, but they collected some data and we were able to go back and look at it. We can at least start there and see what pitfalls there were, maybe identify who we're missing from an expertise standpoint. Maybe we're not just, when I say, and also please, when I say expertise, I don't mean PhD or quantitative or qualitative. I don't mean that. I mean lived experience expertise. So like a lot of times when we try to talk about different patients, like I think of my patient experts. Who are my patients that I've asked to be on my advisory board? If I only select patients and I notice that they're coming from maybe a higher socioeconomic status group, like I know I'm maybe missing something from patients who maybe don't have the financial capacity or abilities, or what if it's difficult for a single parent to have caregiver support while they participate in all these other things. So like I have to be cognizant of like, how am I selecting the people that I'm kind of working with? So I think it's a great comment in terms of then trying to pull it all together. Okay, so here we'll move into the next, as we kind of make sure we're following the time pretty good. I think we're still doing pretty good. So I also touched on briefly in the pre-video about the phases of evaluation. And so I think this also kind of got at the question, as I was kind of articulating, like when you're putting a program together, how you think through the evaluation. But recognizing that like programs can definitely already exist. And so, and I'll try to maybe talk today thinking about like if I were looking back at a program as well as developing a program. So obviously in planning, one of the things that's been really helpful for us over the last few years, I say us, the Patients Program, we've had a external advisory board or steering committee that's been very, that meets quarterly and talks about longer program goals for us, which is very helpful. But then project specific, whenever we decide to start a new project, we typically outreach to different community members that we think might be relevant to and ask their interest in participating. Before we write the grant proposal or before we write the project proposal, we often actually have 2 or 3 meetings beforehand, which we call like a pre-engagement step. And that's trying to understand is in our planning, and that's probably more qualitative in nature in the evaluation feedback that we get that we're focused on that. We're trying to see, are we capturing all the specific things that we think are important. A good example, we've started 2 large studies in COVID-19 testing as well as COVID-19 vaccination clinical trials, and we're doing a lot of patient engagement in the community, and particularly in West Baltimore, and predominantly an African-American population. Before we got started, this was also often led by discussions led by our senior pastor, Pastor Lance, who leads Mount Lebanon Baptist Church in Baltimore. He was able to articulate several components that he felt was really, really critical for the patients or the community members, church parishioners that he works with on a regular basis. And so that gave us insight into how we'd start developing our proposal. Well, we take it as kind of an iterative approach where we'll take that feedback and we'll kind of revise a little bit, and then we'll go back to our advisory board and we'll say, okay, does this reflect what you feel is the most important? And that actually helps when doing a research project. It's also, I think, helpful to do like a whiteboard session, or like kind of put stuff on the whiteboard and kind of draw out like what you think's related to what. And that's a good way to maybe think about a conceptual model, maybe like addressing like what are all the different variables that you're thinking about. Then as you go into implementation of any program, there's a lot of different components depending on the type of intervention or the type of thing that you're studying in a program. If it's a clinical service, you've got to think about, certain regulatory components, and HIPAA, you've got to think about a lot of components in terms of making sure the care is delivered appropriately, that if depending on your service, how do you triage or escalate things to, if you're doing a community level, to use an example, if I were implementing a vaccination program in the community, if I have clinicians in the field delivering vaccinations, I also have to recognize, well, what if something happens? What if someone faints or falls, or there's another issue? Like, you have to think about safety. You have to think about maybe other things that I wouldn't necessarily always consider in a program that was merely educational, or if that makes sense. And so as you're kind of thinking through how well each of these happen, you might go through and say, so how do we evaluate our engagement in the planning stage? If it's iterative in nature, what we do is we start with what was our initial model that we wanted to do. Based on the engagement in the planning stage, how much did our model change based on feedback? And that's actually something we're going to be talking about in this first grant that I mentioned with COVID-19 testing. We have a lot of information based on how our community member feedback influenced everything that we did, and that's how we could sort of evaluate the planning phase. So I think a lot of people are probably thinking mostly on the completion of a program and how we evaluate after completion. One thing that gets missed quite a bit that I think I'm seeing more people focus on now is after you complete a program, what are your methods of evaluating how well you got the message out? Academics, and I'm guilty, I am one, we often evaluate our success on our number of manuscripts, on our the number of citations that go in, the academic journal publication. Well, what if your goal is to actually get more information out to broader communities? A lot of primary health providers may not be keeping up with every journal. A lot of community members may not have any interest in looking at what the latest academic journal publication says. So like, what are the best ways to get at those different communities? So we have a dissemination team that works on things like Facebook Live conversations. We do community health fairs where we can kind of share different events. We have newsletters. We work with the Baltimore Times with it, which is a focused newspaper in the African American community in Baltimore. So like so a lot of our work will make sure we think about an op-ed or a piece that we might submit to there. So that sometimes takes a little bit extra work or a little bit extra thought in terms of the phase. So without giving away, I guess those are some examples, but I want to hear from you guys. What type of evaluation questions might be important to you at different phases, and we can open it up if you have any specific examples that you want me to try to answer or ask, or if you have thoughts on like how you might change it, how might you change your questions depending on what phase you're in.
Remember, you can raise your hand or you can put it directly in the chat, and you can send it to me and I can put it in the chat if you'd rather. But yeah, please, we'd like to hear from you.
Oh, cool. Yeah, is that Mike again? Hey, Mike, go ahead.
So one of the earliest things that it seems to me is important is that when you're building the program, that the discussion, even among your advisory board members, represents a consensus. In other words, it's not a bunch of researchers talking to a bunch of patients, but then deciding what they want to do based on what the researchers are used to doing. It actually reflects what the patients are asking to have done, to whatever extent that is possible. And I've been involved in a number of programs where I have watched that not be the case.
Right.
And I'm not criticizing anybody. I mean, I think this is part of a long learning curve that we're all undergoing.
Right. I think that's a wonderful point actually to bring up the I would say that a lot of this area of research is still relatively new. I think that the evolution of following the Affordable Care Act with PCORI, but even before that, I think the Reinvestment Act and before the Affordable Care Act, we've had recent legislation just in the last 10 to 15 years that have put more resources into research that's a little bit more thoughtful along the engagement all the way to dissemination phases of a project. So I think recognizing that like it's not the same as maybe the investments that have been made in other areas, like following the 1960s legislative changes for clinical trials for pharmaceuticals in the United States. That actually incentivized a lot of research, a lot of funding for clinical trials and randomized controlled trials. Well, we saw, a huge influx of interest in investment in randomized clinical trials after the 1960s. So it's got time. We gotta recognize that it's not like this has been around forever either. So we're still kind of learning. So that's a good comment. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, my question, being at the community level, I think I would be looking at things, the engagement component at the beginning. Yeah. But then when you write the proposals, how did you incorporate my information into your proposal? Because what happens by the time we get to implementation, some folks do not do anything to begin to implement. And especially when it comes to the completion, we, the community, don't know what you're talking about and definitely don't have any dissemination of that point coming back to the beginning.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And Maddie, have you been a part of projects or been asked to do stuff where the proposal was already written and you're brought in after the fact?
Yes, indeed.
That seems to be
my thing. Is you saying what's in this proposal, but when it comes to implementation, I'm going, you're not doing anything. And then when we get to the outcome, I don't see any difference.
Yeah.
A waste of my time.
You're absolutely right. And I won't call out any specific groups or organizations. Let's just say that I was working with, but I was this past year working with a patient organization, helping them through a process where another organization was asking for their input, just like you said. They asked the patient organization for input. I was helping the patient organization as kind of an expert to help them. It was health economists, so let's just leave it at that. Health economists were asking the patient groups for this input. They got all the input, and then when the economic model came out, it didn't look at anything of what the patient said. It's like when they put in their like report, we talked to patient groups, right? But you didn't say, what did you change? You know, to your point. And I think that's the piece that we have to call out, and we have to say, well, wait a second, we told you this, 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 and this. Right. So why are we not seeing it? Now, the challenge can sometimes be is I think it sometimes feels like it's too late, or sometimes it feels like it's like, when you do call it out, are you afraid that you might damage a relationship or whatever? Because part of it's the building the relationship. And if you don't have trust with an organization to give them real feedback, that's a problem too. Like you've got to, one of the things I love about the patient advisors that we've worked with over the last few years of the patients program, and this really, I think, is more kudos to Daniel Mullins and some of the work he really started, groundwork that he started. Our advisors, they take the gloves off. Okay. Like when I present a proposal to my team or to the advisors, they don't sugarcoat the feedback to me. They say, well, Joey, you say you want to do this, but how are you going to make sure that this gets done? And if I come back to the next meeting without like, okay, guys, you all told me you want to do this. What do you think of this proposal? If I don't do that, like I lose so much social capital, I guess is the word, or maybe like I think people might say, wait, is this just another guy that's not really listening to us? He thinks he's the expert, that sort of thing. So I have to recognize that the moment I come back to the table without really answering, is that I damage the potential for them to trust me, any group to trust me. Trying to use another example, even with my students, if my students tell me every year Dr. Mattingly goes on tangents, which I got a few years back, sometimes in my feedback is Dr. Mattingly likes to go on tangents like when he gets into a topic. And one of the reasons why you see me put together a pretty detailed agenda is because I know my weakness is to start talking about other things that maybe are unrelated. So I have to remind myself, where are we at in time? Are we like on task or on point? And so part of that's trying to listen to that feedback that you get. To some of the things where what we've had to do in some cases where a researcher comes to our program, the patients program, sometimes they do have a proposal that they've already written. And they come to us and say, how can we be more patient-centered or whatever? And how can we sometimes it's tough. There have been times we've had to tell a group that we can't work, we're going to, you'll have to come back with a different, or we'll have to start over essentially. And I don't know if a lot of researchers are at the phase where they want to start over. Researchers are often trained to like search the academic literature first and kind of start there, or take what, and rather than they don't have the same experience in terms of reaching out to the community. But we're working on that. And I think to Mike's point earlier is that it's still kind of early in terms of the number of researchers that appreciate talking to your patients and community groups first before putting your proposals together. But I think that's a wonderful comment. And I think there was a comment about the transparency. Love that comment, and doing a better job of like taking someone's comment and saying, okay, this is what we had a comment during this meeting. Here's how we're responding, right? Maybe bolding it or putting it in red and saying, here's our response and how we can address it. So I think it's a good suggestion. Go ahead, Miriam.
Yes, hello. Because I come from healthcare profession background, and especially in quality and safety, I was always having the question why we were not prepared as a health care system to face the epidemic and the consequences, and we were always uncertain of many conditions, many messages to the population, safety or whatever. And these uncertainties during the course of the epidemic and the vaccines periods, when we targeted populations with certain vaccine to come and get it. So we had a lot of uncertainties. So in case of these uncertainties, what steps and whom to involve in order to, to tackle these uncertainties and to gain back the trust in science and medicine?
So thank you for that comment. To try to be respectful to I know the challenges through the pandemic have been quite large, too large for any of us to probably answer in a call today, but we had a lot of challenges, things, some clinical scientific things got political, and that maybe changed the challenge, that created some challenges, I think, as well. Understanding that in science, there is a lot of unknowns. How do we communicate it in a way that's, I'll use, because I mentioned earlier, I'm a pharmacist by training. When I went through my clinical education, they teach us different things about how to interpret studies, how, safety and efficacy for a drug, for example. And so when a patient comes in and is asking me questions about what are the side effects I may be expecting, right? Have you ever even watched one of those drug commercials where you'll see like they go, you got the happy person so excited and they talk about the new drug and then they start rattling off the side effects and the adverse reactions. You're like, whoa, I don't know if I want to go near that. How do we communicate, that list of adverse events, like where those come from, right? And why we expect that those may be there, maybe saying, okay, here's kind of in the clinical trials, maybe it was 10% or 5% or 1% of the population had that, but the trial had to report it. But ultimately, maybe when talking with the patient is helping understand what is their risk reward system, what is their preference, okay? Because the clinical trials also show kind of like an average or, what the overall population, results were. But for the one person you're talking to in the clinic or in the pharmacy or what have you, hearing what they feel is important to them. So like with COVID-19, I don't think COVID-19 testing and vaccinations, like we have our main CDC recommendations and guidelines, but there's a lot more nuance to like understanding different risk factors, different components for each individual. That's probably more meant at that patient level. And also back to the idea, if you don't have trust with a patient, if you're only seeing a patient for the first time, it's probably a challenge to just tell them, here, this is what you need to do because this is the recommendation. If you start out that way, and I made that mistake a few times when I was younger, that I would just jump right in and tell a patient, here's the recommended whatever, without asking them, like, what are your concerns? Like, what are your fears? Like, what are the things that are important to you? If I find out that I'm talking to someone who drives a semi-truck for a living, that person's probably really terrified of those drowsiness stickers on their medication bottles. Not that we all don't, worry about maybe that drowsiness side effect, but that person maybe even have a heightened awareness to that or what have you. So I think ultimately is recognizing that as we move research forward, we have to be humble and say that when we don't know something, that okay, here's what we don't know. Sometimes I think clinicians get in the feeling or getting the space of they're afraid to say that they don't know because they want their patient to maybe do something. And so anyway, I think it's probably better just being open and honest and saying like where you don't know, or just saying like where sometimes I've even said like, if it were me, but that's also not always appropriate because I'm not that person. So I think that's a terrible thing to say. Often it's just like listening to that other person and hearing like what they care about. Sorry, Joe, I saw you went unmuted.
Yeah, I had, I'm going to put it in the chat here real quick. A question from the audience, and I've got another one in a minute, but what are the ethical issues that may arise at the different phases of the evaluation process in community engaged research?
Oh, wow. This is great. And this is why I wish Dr. Bakay was with me right now. This is someone I always often go to Dr. Bakay. I don't know if any of you all met Claudia Bakay or not. She's one of our main collaborators and has been in this space for so many years. So there's so many things to think about. Of course, selecting who you go to, right? This often happens, faculty members like this, if they're trying to evaluate their educational outcomes, they're trying to study their students. Well, what happens when you ask your students for information, and you're trying to study it? Like, they're a protected class. Like, there's a power difference, that's why we have special protections for prisoners and everything. Not, students are sort of prisoners, unfortunately, when we compare them in terms of how we study. So we're thinking about those ethical issues. When we think about selecting, if we're implementing a trial, and say it's a clinical trial, and the service that maybe it's a procedure or something like that, where it's not as easy as, like, I'm just going to give you a bottle of pills and you take one pill a day. Maybe you actually physically have to come into the clinic once a week to receive this procedure or something, or injection or something like that. If I don't take into consideration the missed work and the transportation and all these other things, I'm going to end up selecting a bunch of people who can afford to do it, and I'm going to miss the people that maybe socioeconomically that just can't get off work, or can't, they have to, I don't know how many of you all live in an urban city, like where there's a lot of public transportation. A lot of people rely on things like the bus or the light rail or whatnot. And depending on what, not every community has a lot of public transportation. But when you have public transportation, that's actually can be a kind of a battle for a lot of people who can't afford to just take an Uber. They have to wait on the bus, and the bus can sometimes be erratic or have trouble depending on the city that you live in. So I think and that's from like an implementation phase. On an outcome phase, in the outcome phase or completion, or what are the outcomes that I'm thinking about? Ethically, I think it's important to know, like, how do you report? Like, what if you're finding things that are very important to get to those individuals? So in a clinical trial, those are a little bit more concrete, that we typically have a data safety board to review the outcomes and say, oh, we found, like in one of our groups, we found an adverse event that we didn't expect. Like, it's ethically important to, like, consider stopping the trial or contacting all the patients. We saw that with the vaccines. A lot of the vaccines got unblinded because once they realized, I guess, I don't want to misquote, but I believe they changed the planning of how they evaluated the effectiveness of some of the vaccines. They went ahead and unblinded so that those who got placebo could get the vaccine, things like that. But I mean, I think you'll see that, but that's an ethical thing to consider. Dissemination wise, I don't know if we're seeing as many people really talk about this as much, and I think we should. I think that we should have the conversation about, are you getting the information to the people that to not just academics, not just. And so I don't know where that fits in that paradigm, but I think having a good discussion about, like, how do we make sure more people hear about it? So it's a good question. What else you got, Joe? You got more in the chat box?
Yeah, I've got one more. Could you please elaborate on who is responsible for the evaluations? I would expect the PI, the principal investigator, the funding institution, and perhaps the academic or other institution that is involved. Are there ever requirements for periodic evaluations by external quality assurance groups?
So whoever asked that question did a great job. Like, they know what they're talking about, because they listed off all the typical evaluators, I would say. Certainly, you're going to see primarily, like, the PI for most projects is probably the main person. But yeah, I would say I see more in programmatic programmatic projects. Yeah, like something where you're developing and delivering an entire program. To use an example, this patient program, Professors Academy. I don't know if we are. I know that we have our own internal evaluation, but, like, in the past, sometimes we ask a group like Westat, or we ask another group if they would be willing to be our external evaluator. I definitely think that's a great process to bring on someone to kind of give you that, like, a third party evaluation. So I'm trying to think if there's any other, certainly the funding institution or whoever's paying for it. The challenge sometimes can be is if you do have multiple funders all kind of coming together and saying, hey, we want to do this as a collaborative, different funders may have different goals. And so it's important that everyone it's really clear up front, what are the main things that we're evaluating. I'm sorry, there was a hand up. Sorry, the hand went back down though. Did you have a question?
Actually, that was me, because that was my question. So because I've done that type of work, that's why I asked it. It was also along the same lines. Are there things like audits and inspections? Like, you know, that was something that, and especially in certain groups, they're really, like you mentioned, we step, but there are other organizations that provide that.
Yeah, so there's certainly so the one thing that you may run into if you are required to have an external evaluator, it might get expensive, right? So like if you haven't budgeted for that in your study, and then you find out later that you need to add a external evaluator, that could be substantial. I want to say that in some of the projects I've been a process of, that you could see up to 20% of the total project budget allocated to programmatic evaluation. That's substantial. 20% is quite a lot for a project, and then have all of that set aside just for like an external evaluator. So I think it's a good comment. If it's after the fact, I think that's where you have to talk to the funding institution and discuss, like, okay, I understand you want to capture these items. We did not budget for that, or, you know, then how do we work through that? You know, so maybe it's something where you're having kind of an iterative discussion. I do have a collaborative agreement with a large federal organization that does that a little bit with me, like their outcomes kind of change throughout the project. It's a little frustrating as from my perspective, because I'm like, when we wrote this proposal, this is what I said I was going to do, and now you want me to do these other things. And so it's kind of a dance back to also like, I think we all have to consider, well, it's the relationship, right? If they're not willing to be flexible with you in that conversation, and you're not able to have some transparency in why they need something and what you need, and if you're not able to have the back and forth, there's a good chance, one, they may not fund you again, or two, you may not want to submit for funding to them again. So I've actually had a couple organizations, I'm like, should I submit this grant to this group, or should I go to this other group, because I don't know if I want to deal with that group. And I swear, I mean, that's gone through my head a time or two, and I won't say the organizations. I'll just say that I've definitely had situations where I've been like, I don't know if I want to work with that group again. Good comment. Oh, go ahead, Royce.
Yes. With regarding what you're saying, I think in my experience with IRBs, is that the IRB has a role to play in all of this as well. And agreeing with everything that you're saying, but eventually, when you make changes in the protocol that was approved, you've got to get a second follow-on blessing from the IRB, which is another challenge in itself.
You hit the net. Yeah, that's come up quite typically. Well, I don't know. I guess sometimes that's probably a good reason to push back when those things change. So then you have to have that discussion, because it's going to, one, delay the project, right? Yeah. And then it's like, if the timelines don't change, that's not fair either. Two, you have to think ethically, right? Like, is it appropriate? You know, is it appropriate to change midstream? So I think what's important for all of us when you're having is, back to, like I was saying, like, just be honest and real and say, okay, here's what you're asking me to do. This is what I think are the pros and cons of doing that, right? Like, okay, we can do this, but here's what's going to happen, and we need to make sure you're okay with it. I think I've failed at times, not always putting it in writing as clearly as I should have. But sometimes you learn from your previous mistakes. You're like, okay, if someone tells me this, I'm going to make sure I'm adjusting the timeline. I want to make sure it's in email, and it's like at least an email or something where I say, okay, just to confirm, the timeline for the deliverable is going to change by 2 months or whatever.
Yes.
Thanks, Royce.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead. And I know we're at three minutes till, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Maybe any final thoughts or questions? And again, thank you all for being such an engaged group and so thoughtful in your comments.
Well, if there's no further questions, of course, if you have any further ones, Dr. Mattingly is here in the patients program, and He's a great resource for what we've been talking about today. But I want to thank all of you. For those of you that are in the Patients Professors Academy, you'll hear from me later today with a recording of this session and some more follow-up about what we learned today. Great discussion. I really appreciate everyone that sent your questions in. We're using the chat to talk about different ways to engage. So Dr. Mattingly, if you have anything you want to close with?
No, again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, could I ask a quick question? Dr. Mattingly, is Dr. Mattingly going to be having office hours at some point, Joe?
I can. I don't know if I have it in the calendar. I probably need to follow up with Joe to get something set out, and then I can work with Joe. Has there been a preferred time that works most for the group, or flexible?
It's been kind of as time schedule works, so I can talk to you about that.
I would say to the group as a whole, if I may, Joe, I mean, I have found those office hours really useful because there's a relatively small number of us who participate, and one gets into quite intense discussions about specific issues.
Yeah,
wonderful. Yeah, so I'm open to Joe. If you want to follow up, we can either set a set time, or if needed, I'm also happy to take if I can work individually. If there's a one-off or something like that, I can set up a quick call. Ultimately, for my purposes as well, is building the relationship with all of our learners and our program, because I hope you all know, you all chose to be here. So that tells me something about you. That tells me that you have some type of passion for this, some type of interest for this. And that lets me know, like, you might be a group that I reach back out to say, hey, I have this project. I would love an advisor in this project. So part of it's me getting to know you all too. So in a way, I'm just being transparent. I benefit by getting to know you too.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Dr. Mattingly. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation today. And we really appreciate everyone attending today, and we will be in touch. And thank you so much.